Thank you for that. Robin, yesterday someone said to me in the debate, in the NATO debate, we need a European agenda versus an American agenda as part of the transatlantic agenda. How many agendas do we have in NATO? And how far are these conflicting agendas? And how likely is it that we will get closer at the end of this debate? Can you make some comments on that?
I had a direct question there as well as a chance to make my comments. Janusz, I think I will touch, hopefully, on your question at the same time as saying a couple of the points I wanted to make. Thank you very much for the invitation to you, to Yevgeniy as well. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you obviously to the Polish National Ministry of Defense and to NATO as well. You're right, this is a question about security perceptions, I think, at the moment, and as I am not a NATO analyst, I'm likely to approach this subject much more from a policy and a political standpoint than from a military analytical standpoint. And I think the first point I wanted to make about the new security environment is that ultimately there's very little new to say. So, Bikla, Klaus before me, I'm not going to go through the list. What strikes me, both from looking at the world and listening to the presentation this morning, especially from the Secretary General, is the length of the list. Let's start with a Russia that is not comfortable with the security architecture, the danger of failed states, international terrorism, proliferation, energy security, maritime security. The list is enormous and even daunting. Perhaps there are three dimensions, though, that are also underrunning this. As you may know, the British government has just, the Ministry of Defence finished a green paper, which is meant to be a prelude to a strategic defence review, which will take place next year. And they noted as one of their biggest concerns for the future of the security environment, and I think this is especially important following the financial crisis we've just had, is the rise of an Asia-Pacific region, which is going to quote them, a major global shift as dramatic as the end of the Cold War. And I think, as students of history and of defense, I think we should remind ourselves that these kind of massive tectonic shifts rarely happen without the risk of conflict. And therefore, as we think about the future, the danger of being trapped into an idea that it's Afghanistan plus over the next 10 years maybe isn't part of where the future is. And certainly one hears in this room concerns about major powers potentially drawing in the United States, Europe, NATO, even in areas we had not predicted for the future, and that we may face very different sorts of challenges from those associated with civil-military cooperation, counterinsurgency, etc. in the future. And a kind of third thing about the new environment, obviously, is money. NATO's been talking for all of its history about the need to spend defense resources better, but we are in a completely different environment today. And just as we're moving into the value of counterinsurgency warfare conducted, perhaps some would say correctly now in Afghanistan, we realize how expensive it is in terms of manpower and people. So as we've heard this morning, NATO faces a huge list. It's a list that requires adaptability and flexibility as much as it requires anything else. So to the second part of the question, where does the alliance sit within this new security environment? What's its new future role? I'd be frank about this. I think NATO is struggling, and NATO will struggle to cope with this new security environment. I think there are 2 points on this, and one of these, Janusz, will answer your specific question. The first, however, this is a moment of danger, I think, for the alliance, rather than a moment of opportunity in terms of rewriting the strategic concept. What many have called NATO's ultimate test, which is Afghanistan, has already been a failure. I'm not making any commentary on the success or not of the surge under General McChrystal, which strikes me as a very sensible strategy, which may succeed. But that's not the failure I'm talking about. The failure is that NATO has exposed, I think, for people on both sides of the Atlantic, the very different security perspectives, the profound differences between the view of NATO and maybe a handful of NATO member states on the one hand, and the majority of European states and governments on the other, about the value of expeditionary, land-based power projection to deal with international terrorism, failed states, and all that comes with that particular bag of problems. And if we're talking about NATO having an expeditionary capacity in the future, and that being one of the core missions, I think we have to recognize what Afghanistan has done to those perceptions. I think in the United States and in European capitals, speaking as somebody based in Europe right now, I'd say the lesson for most is that the lesson of Afghanistan is not to be involved in the future in expeditionary operations that involve ground forces, and certainly ones that have nation building somewhere near their core. It doesn't work. I would say a lot of the conclusions. It's hugely expensive, and ultimately for many Europeans it raises greater concerns about their domestic security. The second point I wanted to make, why it's a moment of danger, is much more strategic. I think the United States and European nations as a whole, and I'd even include Britain in this list of European nations, bring a very different hierarchy of security interests to their thinking about security. The United States is one of the poles in a multipolar world. It is capable of acting in a sovereign way in ways that most European countries can't. It has ambitions, it has responsibilities at an international level that are hugely important to it and to the world. And as a result, NATO is almost seen as part of the toolbox for being able to deal with that range of problems. And an expeditionary NATO, therefore, is an important one as part of that mix. My sense is that most European states view security at best through a regional prism. It's the Balkans, it's North Africa, it's Eastern Europe, it's Russia. And probably for most, actually, it's principally about domestic security. It's about the vulnerability of European states to domestic terrorism. Not international terrorism, but domestic terrorism inside our countries, illegal migration, organized crime, etc. And when you look at that list of challenges, intelligence cooperation, police cooperation, judicial cooperation becomes important as what may or may not be able to be done at a NATO military level. And if I can say a quick word, Janusz, as if Ganesh wanted me to bring a bit of a British perspective, we are coming up to an election in Britain in a couple of months' time. And it's been fascinating, as somebody's returned to Britain from the US, to watch the nature of the debate about foreign and security policy, which is a very small part, obviously, of the debate in this pre-election phase. But one of the most fascinating parts is this sense of insecurity about where Britain stands vis-à-vis the United States. That in a way our relationship is changing at a structural level, nothing to do with personalities. That in a way we need to prepare ourselves for a United States that is looking far more globally at areas, whether it be China, resetting the relationship with Russia, areas where Britain maybe isn't important. And NATO for us had been that ultimate linkage with the United States, and an insecurity, I'd say, both on the Conservative Party as well as in the Labour Party about where we fit with the United States. And I see British politicians thinking some about Europe as an alternative almost, or something that we need to invest more effort into, but concerned that maybe that won't be productive because we are somewhat skeptical about what European security cooperation can really achieve, and then thinking even about bilateral relationships, whether they be European countries like France or with a whole range of our former Commonwealth partners, as something that we need to think about in parallel to NATO, in parallel to the US. So this security debate, the strategic concept, is taking place at a moment where our relative positions, the United States and European nations, are going through profound sense of reassessment. It's a very difficult and fluid environment on which to build a strategic concept. To stick to my 8 minutes, I think I've got about 30 seconds left, let me do a final comment about, therefore, where I see the strategic concept and a credible future role for the alliance is.